He did not use a gun. He did not use a knife. He did not even use a word. He used 300 tons of pressurized iron ore, 2 industrial blast furnaces, and a set of steel doors that had been welded into their frames 6 months before the SS ever set foot in his factory. That is how Lucjan Nadbór killed 40 SS guards on a Wednesday afternoon in February 1943. He locked the doors, he turned the dials, he walked away, and the furnaces did the rest. This is not the story you expect it to be. There is no heroic charge, no escape through sewers, no dramatic last stand. There is a man who understood heat better than any human being should ever have to understand it. A man who had spent 22 years feeding raw ore into the belly of a blast furnace and coaxing it, degree by precise degree, into something useful. A man who knew that at 700 degrees Celsius, steel softens, that at 900, it begins to fail, that at 1200, a human body does things that cannot be described in polite language, or any language at all. He knew all of this, and on the afternoon of February the 11th, 1943, he used every piece of that knowledge to end 40 lives in a sealed hall in the city of Krakow. The story was classified by the Polish government in exile within 3 months of the event. The Soviets, who arrived in Krakow in January 1945, buried it further. It did not fit their preferred narrative of liberation, and it carried uncomfortable questions about industrial infrastructure, worker collaboration, and the deliberate choices made by ordinary men under extraordinary pressure. For decades, the only evidence it happened at all was a single requisition document recovered from an SS administrative archive in Berlin, requesting the urgent replacement of 40 uniforms and 40 sidearms issued to Untersturmbannführer Oskar V's security detail, effective February 12, 1943. The reason given for the requisition was 2 words stamped in red ink: Vernichtung durch Katastrophe, destruction by catastrophe. The catastrophe had a name, and he had 2 hands, a foreman's key, and the patience of a man who had learned to wait before he acted. This is his story. Lucjan Nadbór was born in 1903 in a village called Gniewoszów, 30 kilometers southeast of Radom in central Poland. It was a small place, coal dust on every windowsill, the sound of hammering from before dawn, the smell of hot metal carried on the wind from the smelting works 3 kilometers north. His father was Boleslaw Nadbór, boiler mechanic, a quiet man who spoke in sentences of 7 words or fewer and communicated most of his values through demonstration rather than speech. He never told Lucjan to work hard. He simply worked hard, every day, 6 days a week, returning home with burns on his forearms and satisfaction in his eyes that required no verbal explanation. He never told Lucjan to think before he spoke. He simply waited before he said anything, weighing his words with the same patience he brought to calibrating pressure valves, and Lucjan watched him and learned. The family home had 3 rooms: the kitchen, the sleeping room, and what Boleslaw called the thinking room, a narrow space at the back of the house, with a single window overlooking the back garden where he kept his tools, his technical manuals, and a shelf of dog-eared books on metallurgy and mechanical engineering that he had collected over 20 years. He could not read them all. His formal schooling had ended at 12, but he could read enough, and what he could not decode, he had taught himself through trial and practice, and the margins of those books were covered in his careful, cramped handwriting. Observations, corrections, questions that he had answered himself through experimentation. Lucjan grew up in that room. Not literally. He slept in the bedroom with his younger brother Vladek, who is not part of this story. But intellectually, he grew up surrounded by those books, those margins, that patient accumulation of self-taught knowledge. By the time he was 9, he could identify 12 types of metal failure from visual inspection alone. By 11, he could read a basic engineering schematic. By 13, when he began accompanying his father to the smelting works on weekends to learn the operation of the boiler systems, he already understood the theoretical framework that underpinned what he saw. Theory and practice met in him early, and the joint was clean. He did not attend university. The family could not afford it, and Lucjan was not a boy who resented the things he couldn't have. He took an apprenticeship at the smelting works at 16, learning the full operation cycle of a blast furnace under a foreman named Victor Das, a fierce, barrel-chested man of 50 who had spent his entire working life in proximity to liquid metal and carried the scars to prove it. Ash had no patience for laziness and no interest in explaining himself twice. He taught through demonstration and consequence. You learned because the alternative to learning was being badly hurt, and Lucjan was not a person who needed to be hurt twice to understand a lesson. Within 3 years, Lucjan understood the blast furnace in the way that a musician understands their instrument. Not just technically, but physically, intuitively. He knew what a change in the color of the flame meant before any gauge confirmed it. He knew the difference in sound between iron ore behaving correctly and iron ore that was about to cause a problem. He felt the furnace through the soles of his boots, through the vibration in the floor, through the air temperature on the back of his neck. The furnace was not a machine to him. It was a system with a personality, with moods, with a set of consistent preferences that he had memorized across thousands of hours of close attention. He was promoted to assistant foreman at 23, full foreman at 27. By 30, he was responsible for overseeing the entire furnace floor of a mid-sized ironworks in Krakow, the Huta Nadbrzeże works, 12 furnaces operating in 2 parallel halls, 340 workers across 3 shifts, producing pig iron at a rate of 2,600 tons per month. The work was everything. Not because he had no inner life. He did, a rich one, quiet and private, but because the work was honest and demanding and required the best of him at every moment. And giving the best of himself felt good. It felt, if he had been the kind of man to use the word, like grace. He married Wisława Karaś in 1929. She was the daughter of a pharmacist in the Podgórze district of Krakow, a small woman with dark eyes and a dry sense of humor that she deployed without warning, usually at the precise moment Lucjan was taking himself too seriously. They had one son, Artur, born in 1932. Artur was a careful, watchful boy who had his father's eyes and his mother's timing, and by the age of 6, he had already developed the habit of pausing before he answered questions. The Nadbór instinct for measured response, already visible in the second generation. They lived in a flat on Ulica Rakowica, 4 rooms, on the 3rd floor of a building that smelled of cabbage soup and coal smoke and the particular mildew of any building that had been standing since 1890. It was not an elegant life, it was a good one. Lucjan walked to work in 35 minutes. He came home to dinner and to Wisława's commentary on the day and to Artur's questions, which were always worth answering. On Sunday mornings, he sat in the thinking chair he'd inherited from his father and read metallurgy still, mostly, but also history, and sometimes, in the last years before the war, politics, though politics filled him with the unease that history and metallurgy did not. He was not a political man by inclination. He did not distrust politics exactly. He distrusted its relationship to reality. Politicians talked about steel production the way men who had never stood in front of a blast furnace talked about steel production. In abstractions, in percentages, in targets that had been set in offices 200 kilometers away by people who did not understand what it cost, in human terms and physical terms, to move those numbers by even 1%. He had learned to work around political reality rather than engaging with it directly. This was not cowardice, it was pragmatism. And it served him well until September 1939, when pragmatism ran out, and every Polish citizen found themselves in direct, inescapable contact with a political reality that would not be worked around. The Germans entered Krakow on September 6, 1939. The city was declared the capital of the general government, the rump Polish territory that had not been annexed directly into the Reich, but was to be administered as what one German planner called a great labor reservoir. The factories were essential. Steel, iron, armaments. The Reich had immediate urgent need of Polish industrial capacity. The Huta Nadbrzeże works was operational within 4 days of the German arrival. The foreman remained. The workers remained. The furnaces kept burning. The German takeover of the factory was managed through a process that the occupiers called rationalization. What it meant in practice was the insertion of a German administrative layer above the existing Polish workforce. The factory director, a man named Poborski, who had owned the majority stake in the works since 1926, was removed. His office was given to a German civilian administrator named Ewald Groh, a manufacturing engineer from Stuttgart, 44 years old, precise, cold, and technically competent in a way that Lucjan found grudgingly impressive and deeply dangerous. Gross understood iron production well enough to know what was possible and to demand it. He set quotas. He restructured shift patterns. He reduced the crew per furnace from 8 to 6, compensating for the reduction in manpower by extending shift lengths from 10 hours to 12. He did not shout. He did not threaten, not initially. He simply set the parameters and communicated the consequences of failure to meet them. And the consequences were not difficult to imagine. Lucjan adapted. He had no choice, and he was, in any case, genuinely skilled at adapting. He restructured his supervisory routines to cover the reduced crews. He modified his maintenance schedules to catch problems earlier, compensating for the reduced margin of error that came with pushing the furnaces harder and faster. He kept his mouth shut about the conditions he was operating under. He kept his workers alive. He did what a foreman does, which is make the unworkable work. And he did it so well that Groh, within 6 months, had effectively stopped questioning his decisions and was simply accepting his output reports as reliable and moving on. This was not collaboration. This was survival management. There is a line between the two, and in a functioning occupation, the line is difficult to see. Lucjan knew where it was. He kept track of it with the same precision he brought to tracking furnace temperatures. He was not making weapons for the Reich out of love. He was keeping his workers employed, housed, and fed in a city where the alternative to factory employment was transport east. He kept making that calculation every day, and every day the calculation came out the same. And he kept making iron. He made contact with the Armia Krajowa, the Home Army, in the spring of 1941, not through any dramatic recruitment effort. Through Simon Drong, who was a former schoolteacher turned foreman's assistant, a thin, nervous man with quick eyes who had grown up 3 streets from Lucjan and who approached him one afternoon after the late shift with a proposal that took 30 seconds to deliver and required no explanation or elaboration. Drong was AK. He wanted access to the factory's materials inventory, specifically scrap metal and chemical reagents from the maintenance stores. Lucjan listened, said nothing for 60 seconds, then said yes. Over the following 18 months, he allowed controlled quantities of material to leave the factory through the AK logistics network. Not enough to be noticed in the inventory discrepancy reports. Not enough to trigger an investigation. Precisely calibrated amounts. The kind of marginal losses that any industrial operation of that size would generate through ordinary breakage, wastage, and shrinkage, and which any competent administrator would classify as acceptable variance. He was so precise about it that Gross's quarterly audits never flagged a single anomaly. He was also accumulating knowledge. Every month, under German administration, gave him a more detailed understanding of the factory's security arrangements, the patrol patterns, the guard rotation schedules, the locations of the external locks, and the internal access controls. He was not planning anything yet. He was simply watching, recording, filing. The same patient information gathering that a good foreman applies to any system he is responsible for understanding. The system he was mapping was not the furnaces. It was the 40 men who guarded them. The SS Sicherheitskommando, the security detail assigned to industrial facilities classified as critical to the Reich war effort, had been present at the Huta Nadbrzeże works since August 1941. Their original assignment was 8 men, a light guard unit responsible for perimeter security and worker access control. By January 1943, following a series of sabotage incidents at other Krakow factories that had destroyed machinery and killed 3 German supervisors, the detail had been reinforced to 40 men. 40, an entire Zug, a platoon strength unit, assigned to a single ironworks. Their commander was SS Hauptsturmführer Oskar Pau. He was 31 years old. He had a face like a closed fist and the eyes of a man who had not slept well in years. He was from Hamburg. He had studied law for 2 semesters before the war and carried the half-formed certainties of an education interrupted before it could be interrogated. He was not stupid. He was not sadistic in the theatrical manner of the SS officers, whose behavior made them memorable in court testimony after the war. He was simply efficient, obedient in the way that the regime's machinery required, without the friction of private conscience slowing him down. He did his job. He processed workers. He flagged security concerns. He executed orders. He had been at the factory for 4 months when Lucjan killed him. But that is getting ahead of things. The ironworks occupied a complex of 14 buildings in the industrial district north of the Wisla, covering approximately 3 hectares of ground. The centerpiece was the main production hall, a vast cathedral-like structure of iron and glass, built in 1907, 68 meters long, 32 meters wide, 18 meters high at the apex of the roof. Inside were the 2 primary blast furnaces, designated Furnace 1 and Furnace 2, each standing 14 meters high, with a combined daily pig iron output capacity of 320 tons under optimal conditions. The furnaces were the kind of structure that demanded respect, not metaphorical respect, actual, physical, biologically instinctive respect of the kind that every species with working nerve endings develops in the proximity of things that can end it. They were not beautiful. They were enormous and functional and utterly indifferent, and they radiated heat at a rate that made the air around them shimmer and ripple at a distance of 10 meters, even when operating at their standard working temperature of 1100 degrees Celsius. At full blast, a sustained operating temperature that the furnaces could reach in approximately 4 hours from a cold start, but which, once achieved, could be increased further by reducing airflow restrictions and feeding additional ore and coke. They operated at 1400 degrees Celsius. The casting floor directly in front of the furnace tap hole reached ambient temperatures of 60 degrees Celsius during full blast operation. The air was thick with iron oxide dust and sulfur compounds and the faint acrid smell of burning carbon. Workers wore heat-resistant clothing, leather aprons, face shields. They moved efficiently and without lingering. No one stood in front of a blast furnace at full operation a moment longer than necessary. The main production hall had 8 access points, 4 at ground level, 2 large cargo doors on the north wall, wide enough to admit an ore cart, and 2 personnel doors, one on the east face and one on the west. 4 at elevation, 2 ventilation access hatches on the roof, 1 emergency egress door on the east gallery level, and 1 service access hatch above Furnace 2 that required a ladder and had not been used in 6 years. What made the main production hall significant from a security standpoint, and from the standpoint of what Lucjan was planning, was what had been done to it in August 1942. Following the sabotage incidents at the other Krakow factories, Gross had ordered a comprehensive security upgrade of the production hall. This included the installation of reinforced blast doors on all 4 ground-level access points. These were not ordinary industrial doors. They were pressure-rated doors, originally designed for use in furnace room access points in German naval facilities, adapted here for surface installation. Each door was made from 22 millimeters of laminated steel plate, mounted on heavy-gauge hinges with a locking mechanism that used a keyed bolt system requiring simultaneous engagement of both internal and external bolts to open. The stated purpose was blast containment, to prevent a sabotage explosion in the production hall from propagating into adjacent buildings. The practical effect was that once those doors were closed and locked from both sides, they could not be opened without the appropriate keys. And the appropriate keys existed in only 3 copies, one held by Gro, one held by Fau, and one held by the factory foreman. Lucjan held the foreman's key. He had held it since the doors were installed. He had tested them carefully, thoroughly, and privately over the course of 6 weeks in the autumn of 1942. He knew exactly how long they took to close. He knew the sequence of the bolt engagement. He knew that once the external bolt was engaged from the outside, the door could not be opened from within without the external key, and that the internal bolt alone provided approximately 45 minutes of resistance to forced entry using standard Wehrmacht-issued demolition charges. He knew all of this because he was the foreman, and the foreman knows his building the way a doctor knows a body, completely, functionally, without sentiment. He also knew something that neither Gross nor Pfau knew. The roof ventilation hatches, installed in 1907 and never upgraded, could be closed and latched from the floor level using a pulley system on the east wall. The system had been installed as an emergency smoke control measure and had never been tested in a real emergency. Lucjan had tested it in October 1942, on a Sunday morning when the factory was empty. Both hatches closed, both latches engaged. Functional. He then tested the furnace control systems, specifically the blast pressure regulators, which governed the rate at which preheated air was forced into the furnace chambers, and which, in conjunction with the ore and coke feed rate, determined operating temperature. He ran the calculation that he had been turning over in his mind since August: how long to reach lethal ambient air temperature in the sealed main hall at maximum blast pressure, assuming the ventilation hatches were closed, assuming both furnaces running simultaneously. He did this calculation not on paper, but in his head, using the thermodynamic principles his father had taught him and the operational data he had accumulated across 22 years. He checked it twice. The same number came back both times. Approximately 90 minutes from initiation to an ambient air temperature inside the sealed hall that would cause fatal heat stroke in an adult male in good physical condition. Longer for someone in heavy clothing, SS uniforms, boots, leather equipment. Call it 2 hours. He filed this information in the same part of his mind where he kept furnace maintenance schedules and shift rotation data. He did not think about it again for 3 months. Simon Drong came to him on February the 8th, 1943. It was a Tuesday. The late shift had just ended, and the production hall was cooling slowly. The furnaces banked down to maintenance temperature, 600 degrees, a deep metallic orange glow visible through the inspection vents. Drong was not a man who wasted words. He said what he needed to say in 4 sentences, and Lucjan stood very still and listened. The AK had intelligence, source not specified, but reliable, that Faust Sicherheitskommando was preparing to conduct a mass arrest operation at the factory. The operation was scheduled for February the 11th. The target was the entire workforce of the B shift, 87 workers, on suspicion of collective resistance activities. The intelligence was that this was not a standard investigation, but a cleanup action. B shift workers were to be transported to Plazo. They were not expected to return. Plazo, the forced labor camp that had been built on the site of 2 Jewish cemeteries in the southern district of the city. By early 1943, its reputation was already fully established. Workers transported there did not, as a matter of statistical record, come back. Lucjan asked 2 questions. First, was the intelligence reliable? Drong said yes. Second, what was the AK's plan for the 11th? Drong said there was no plan yet, and that was why he was having this conversation. Lucjan said he would think about it. He spent the next 48 hours thinking, not pacing, not sleepless. He was a man of exceptional internal stillness, a quality that the people who worked with him often found unnerving until they understood that it was not absence of emotion, but presence of mind. He thought while he performed his normal supervisory duties. He thought while he walked his morning route from Rakowicka to the factory. He thought while he ate dinner across from Wisława, who looked at him with her dark eyes and said nothing, because after 14 years of marriage, she knew the difference between his normal quiet and his planning quiet. And she was not a woman who interfered with processes that were working correctly, he told her on the night of the 9th. Not the plan. The plan was not yet fully formed, but the situation, the 87 workers. The 11th, Plazow, he told her, because she was his partner in the full sense, and because she deserved to know what was being decided in her kitchen, and because her assessment of a situation was invariably useful, even when she said nothing. She said one thing. She said, "Tell me what you need me to do," he said. "Take Artur to your sister's flat in Nova Huta on the morning of the 11th, and stay there until I send word." She nodded. That was the end of the conversation. On the morning of the 10th, he met with Drong and described the plan. Drong listened without interruption. When Lucjan finished, Drong was quiet for 7 seconds. Then he said, "The workers. What happens to the workers?" Lucjan said, "The B-shift workers do not come in on the 11th. They are told, through the AK's communication networks, without any explanation that could be traced. That B shift is cancelled. A different reason for each man. Sick child. Urgent repair at home. Lost access card. Whatever Drong's people could arrange. 87 different reasons. The AK had done this kind of thing before. Drong said it was achievable. Then Lucjan asked his critical question. He needed to know exactly when Fow's security detail would be in the main production hall. His plan required all 40 guards to be inside simultaneously. The arrest operation, as described, would begin in the main hall. It was the assembly point where B-shift workers gathered at the start of their shift. Fow would bring his full detail for a mass arrest of 87 people. But if no workers showed up, would he abort? This was the central uncertainty. Lucjan thought about it from Fow's perspective. A Hauptsturmführer who had been tasked with a cleanup action and who arrived at his assembly point to find no workers did not, in Lucjan's assessment, simply leave. He investigated. He secured the building. He brought his men inside to search it. He made certain the building was clear before he reported back to his superiors that his intelligence was bad. He would bring his men inside. He would keep them inside while he assessed the situation. He would do this because that was what a methodical German security officer did. That was all Lucjan needed. He told Drong the plan. Drong sat with it for a long time. Then he said, "You understand what this is? It is not sabotage. It is not theft of materials. This is 40 men." Lucjan said he understood. Drong asked, "Can you do it?" Not can the plan work. Drong seemed to accept that it could work. Can you do it? Meaning, when the moment came, would Lucjan's hands close the doors and turn the dials? Lucjan said yes. He did not say it quickly. He did not say it with heat. He said it the way he said most things. After a pause, with full attention, having checked the answer for accuracy before delivering it. The morning of February the 11th, 1943, was cold enough to see your breath from the moment you opened your front door, -14 degrees Celsius. The streets of Krakow were white with overnight frost, the tram rails sheeted in ice, the sky a flat, featureless grey. Lucjan was up at 4:30. He ate breakfast, bread, cold ham, ersatz coffee, in the kitchen alone. Wisława and Artur had left the previous evening. The flat was very quiet. He dressed in his work clothes, heavy trousers, flannel shirt, canvas work jacket, leather apron that he wore folded over his arm to start. His foreman's key was in his left jacket pocket, where it always was. He put on his boots, thick-soled, iron-capped, the kind of boots that a foundry worker chose for practical reasons and which also happened, incidentally, to be the kind of boots a person could walk away from a foundry in without leaving distinguishing impressions in soft ground. He took his work bag. He walked to the factory. He arrived at 5:50, 40 minutes before the start of what would have been B shift. The overnight A shift was ending. Witold Karch, his most senior furnace operator, a 58-year-old with forearms like ship cable and a lifetime of burns on his hands, was running the handover check on Furnace 1. Lucjan told Karch that there was a malfunction report on the secondary ore feed that required the full furnace hall to be cleared for maintenance inspection. A shift would hand over early. Everyone except Lucjan was to clear the building. Karch looked at him, said nothing. He had worked with Lucjan for 11 years. He did not ask unnecessary questions. He nodded and began the handover process. By 6:20, the production hall was clear. Every worker from the overnight shift had signed out and left the building. The two furnaces were at maintenance temperature, Furnace 1 at 620 degrees, Furnace 2 at 590. The ore feeds were loaded. The blast pressure systems were at standby. The hall was hot and quiet and orange-lit, the air thick with the iron smell that never entirely left the space, even when the furnaces were banked. Lucjan walked the hall. He checked each access point. Cargo doors on the north wall, closed, unlatched. Personnel door east, closed, unlatched. Personnel door west, closed, unlatched. Roof ventilation hatches, open, pulley lines clear. Everything as it should be for a building about to receive 40 armed men who believed they were conducting an arrest operation. He went to the furnace control stations, Furnace 1, Furnace 2. He checked the blast pressure regulators. He checked the ore feed controls. He checked the temperature monitoring systems. Everything functional, everything ready. He positioned himself at the foreman station on the east wall, elevated 3 steps above the casting floor on a steel grate platform that gave a clear view of the entire hall. He could see both furnaces from here. He could see all 4 ground-level access points, could reach the furnace 1 controls in 6 paces and the roof ventilation pulley system in 8. He had timed this. He had timed everything. He waited. Fowl arrived at 6:41. The sound came first. Boots on the concrete apron outside the north cargo doors. The particular rhythm of a military formation moving in double file. Lucjan did not move from the foreman's station. He counted the beat of the boots. He counted the shadows visible through the frosted clerestory windows of the upper hall. Moving shapes, moving quickly, filling the concrete apron to the north. The north cargo door opened. Fowl came through first, which was either professional procedure or a personal preference for being at the front of things. Lucjan had observed both tendencies in the man. Behind him, filing through in 2 wide, were his men. Lucjan counted. He counted to the rhythm of the furnaces. He counted to 40, and the last man through was a young private. He could not have been more than 20 years old, who was still doing up the top button of his jacket as he crossed the threshold into the warmth. The door did not close immediately. It was a cargo door, hung on heavy hinges, and it swung slowly under its own weight. Fowl was already moving toward the center of the hall, surveying the empty space, the absence of 87 workers. His face, what Lucjan could see of it from 20 meters away, showed the particular blankness of a competent man recalibrating. He turned to one of his officers, a junior lieutenant whose name Lucjan had never learned and would never need to, and said something in German. The officer began deploying men to the corners of the hall, the standard secure and search disposition for a large enclosed space. They moved professionally, efficiently, their boots loud on the casting floor, their breath visible in the furnace warm air. The north cargo door reached the closed position. Its weight settled into the frame with a deep, resonant thud. Lucjan was moving before the echo died. He came down from the foreman's platform at a controlled pace. Not running, not slow. The pace of a man going to check something. He crossed the casting floor on the diagonal, passing within 15 meters of Fowl, who glanced at him. Lucjan did not look back. He kept his eyes on the east personnel door. He reached it in 11 seconds. He closed it from the inside. He engaged the internal bolt, a heavy steel bar that slid into the door frame with a sound that was covered by the noise of 40 men and 2 furnaces. He did not look back. He moved to the west personnel door. Here was the first danger point. One of Fowl's men had been deployed to the west side of the hall and was standing approximately 8 meters from the west door, facing away, scanning the storage alcoves. Lucjan reached the door. He put his hand on the bolt. He felt the man's presence at his back, not physically, but the way you feel another person's attention, the particular weight of someone who might at any moment decide to look in your direction. He slid the bolt home. The sound was negligible. The man did not turn. The second cargo door, set in the north wall 20 meters east of the first, was unmanned. Lucjan crossed to it in 17 seconds. He engaged the external bolt from the inside using a tool he had made himself 4 months earlier, a bent steel rod that allowed him to reach through the gap between the door and frame and engage the external bolt from the inside, eliminating the need to exit and re-enter. He had practiced this. It took 6 seconds. The bolt engaged. 3 down. 1 to go. The first north cargo door, the one through which Fowl and his men had entered, stood closed at the far end of the hall. Between Lucjan and that door were 40 men, at various positions throughout the space, some beginning to converge towards Fowl in the center, as it became clear there were no workers to arrest and a new set of orders was needed. This was the critical moment. This was the moment the plan either worked or didn't, and everything that came after it was consequence. Lucjan walked toward the first cargo door, directly through the cluster of men forming around Fowl. He did not go around them. Going around would have been the behavior of a man with something to hide. He walked through the cluster with the complete physicality of a foreman going to check his building, which was what he was. He nodded to one man who stepped aside for him. He did not make eye contact with Pfau, which was not suspicious, because Lucjan habitually avoided eye contact with the SS, which Pfau had surely noticed, and filed a standard Polish worker deference. He reached the first cargo door. He turned his back to the hall. He engaged the internal bolt. He lifted the external bolt tool from where he had placed it behind the doorframe. He had placed it there on Saturday, 3 days earlier, during a routine maintenance check, which gave the procedure an air of preparation that was accurate in a sense Pfau would never appreciate. He engaged the external bolt. 2 seconds. 3. Click. 4 doors. All locked. He turned back to the hall. Pfau was looking at him, not with suspicion, with the expression of a man who wants information from the nearest available source. He said, in German, "Foreman, where are your workers?" Lucjan said, "The shift was cancelled. Maintenance fault. I have been trying to reach the administrative office since this morning, but who cancelled it?" "The duty administrator. I have the paperwork at the Foreman station. If you'll come with me, I can show you." He was already moving back toward the east wall, back toward the furnace control stations. Behind him, he heard Pfau tell his men to hold positions, and heard the sound of boots on casting floor as Pfau followed him. Lucjan climbed the 3 steps to the foreman's platform. Pfau climbed them after him. Lucjan went to the small shelf above the control panel that served as his administrative desk and began leafing through papers with the business-like thoroughness of a man who was confident the document was there somewhere. "It's here," he said. "I had it this morning. The maintenance report. The secondary ore feed on Furnace 2, if you want to see the technical record." Pfau was not interested in the technical record, but he was standing at the Foreman station, and the Foreman station was on the east side of the hall, and Lucjan's hands were on the furnace control panel, which was integrated into the Foreman station because the foreman needed to be able to respond rapidly to any change in furnace conditions from his supervisory position. Lucjan's left hand found the Furnace 2 blast pressure regulator. His right hand was still moving papers. He turned the regulator. Not all the way. Not yet. Just enough to begin the temperature climb. The change in the furnace's voice was instantaneous. The deep, constant roar deepened further, a subsonic shift that you felt more than heard, a change in the pressure of the air against your skin. Every man in that hall who had any experience of furnace operations would have noticed it. None of Pfau's men had that experience. Pfau noticed it. He looked at Furnace 2, then back at Lucjan. What was that? "Furnace settling," Lucjan said. "It does that when the temperature fluctuates. The maintenance fault causes intermittent variations in the blast pressure. That's why we cancelled the shift." He produced a maintenance report, a genuine one, from 2 weeks ago, describing an actual minor fault in the ore feed system that had since been repaired, but which was still on file, and handed it to Pfau. Pfau looked at it. He looked back at the furnace. He looked at Lucjan. Lucjan met his gaze. He held it for exactly long enough to be the gaze of a man who was telling the truth and knew he was telling the truth, and not long enough to be the gaze of a man who was challenging him. He had calibrated this in advance. He was good at calibration. Pfau said, "Get me Grow." Lucjan said, "Of course. The office telephone is on the north wall. I'll take you there." He was already walking, past the Furnace 1 control station, where his right hand dropped to the blast pressure regulator as he passed and turned it, smoothly, without breaking stride. Furnace 1 joined its voice to Furnace 2's, the hall taking on a new sonic character. Fuller, louder, the heat already beginning to build in the upper air of the space. He walked toward the north wall, toward, incidentally, the roof ventilation pulley system on the east wall of the north section. He reached the telephone. Pfau was behind him. He lifted the handset and dialed the number for the administrative office with complete accuracy because he had been dialing it for 4 years and knew it without thought. He heard it ring. It rang twice, 3 times. He had been counting on the administrative office not answering at 6:50 in the morning, and the administrative office did not disappoint him. "No answer yet," he told Pfau. "The morning administrator usually arrives at 7. Perhaps if you want to wait in the front office, we'll wait here." "Of course." He put the handset down. He turned toward the east wall. He was now at the north end of the hall, 12 meters from the ventilation pulley system. He walked toward it with the purposeful stride of a man going to check the equipment he is responsible for, because that was what he was doing. He reached the pulley system. He checked it with a visual inspection that was both genuine and a delay tactic, while Fow's attention moved away from him to survey the hall, the furnaces, the absent workers. He gripped the east pulley line. He pulled it smoothly, hand over hand, 8 pulls for the east hatch. He heard the hatch close, the mechanical sound of the latch engaging at the top of the hall, 18 meters above the casting floor. He moved to the west pulley line without pausing. At this moment, one of Fow's men shouted something in German. Lucjan did not understand the specific words, but understood the register. Alert, not panic. Something noticed. He did not turn. He pulled the west pulley line. 5 pulls. 6. The second hatch closed. He turned. Fow was staring at him from the center of the hall. Not the polite attention of a moment ago. The full, focused attention of a man who has just understood that something is wrong. His right hand was on his holster. He had not drawn the weapon, but his hand was on it. And the distance between his hand being on the holster and the weapon being in his hand was approximately 1 second, which was not enough time for Lucjan to do anything except be completely, utterly still. Fow said, in German, "Open those doors." Lucjan said, in Polish, "I don't speak German well." It bought him perhaps 3 seconds. Fow switched to Polish. He spoke it badly, haltingly, with the grammar of a man who had learned it as a security tool rather than a language. The doors. Open. Lucjan said, "The ventilation. I closed the ventilation because of the maintenance fault. The dust levels exceed safety limits when the furnaces are running above 700, and we can't open them again until the shift supervisor has conducted an inspection." And Fow drew the weapon. The sound of it, a Walther P38, clearing the leather of the holster in a single practiced pull, was very clear in the hall despite the furnace noise. 40 men heard it. The hall went quiet in the specific way that a space full of armed men goes quiet when their commanding officer draws a weapon, which is that every other weapon in the room shifts half an inch toward readiness. Lucjan looked at the gun. He had known this moment would come. He had rehearsed it in the same cold interior space where he rehearsed every critical sequence. He said, in German slowly and carefully, "I cannot open the doors from here. The external bolts are mechanical. I need to go outside." This was a lie. He could not open the doors at all. The external bolt tool was behind door 1, and even if he reached it, the door required the external key to fully disengage the lock. But it was a useful lie because it suggested a path forward for Fow, and a man with a drawn weapon who has been offered a path forward will often, for a moment, lower the weapon to think. Fow did not lower the weapon, but he did stop advancing. He was thinking. Lucjan could see it. The rapid assessment of a trained security officer processing an anomaly, looking for the logical path through it. The doors. Why were they closed? The workers. Where were they? The ventilation. Why had the foreman closed it? The furnaces. Louder now, the heat beginning to accumulate in the upper air of the hall. The heat was the thing that was going to settle this. Because Fow was a good officer, and he was going to process the anomaly correctly if given enough time, and Lucjan did not have enough time to give him. But the heat was not waiting for either of them to finish thinking. The heat was already doing its work. In 12 minutes, the air temperature in the upper hall would reach 65 degrees Celsius. In 22 minutes, it would reach 80. The closed ventilation hatches trapped the radiant heat from 2 furnaces burning at and above their normal operating temperature in a sealed space of approximately 39,000 cubic meters. And the temperature increase was not linear. It accelerated as the walls and the ceiling absorbed and reflected heat, as the floor of the casting space radiated it upward, as the iron and steel of the furnace casings glowed with it. Fow said something to his lieutenant. The lieutenant began moving men to the doors. Lucjan watched them try the north cargo doors, both locked from the outside, bolts fully engaged, the doors immovable without the key or significant demolition equipment. He watched them try the east personnel door, locked from the inside, internal bolt engaged, the only way to open it from the outside. He watched them try the west personnel door. The same. He watched Fow process this. Fow looked back at him. The Walther was still raised. For a moment, 8, 9, 10 seconds, the hall was very still, except for the furnaces, which were not still at all, but getting louder, getting hotter, the heat visible now in the shimmer of the air above the casting floor. Pow said, in German, You did this. Lucjan said nothing. Open them. Open them now or I will shoot you. Lucjan said nothing. What happened next is recorded, insofar as it is recorded at all, in a single sentence, in a post-war AK intelligence debrief document that was classified until 1991. The sentence reads, the subject reported that at this juncture, Hauptsturmführer Pfau discharged his weapon once at close range. The bullet struck Lucjan in the left shoulder, upper, near the collarbone. He went down, not from the wound alone, but from the impact, the shock of it, the sudden authoritative noise of the shot in the enclosed space. He hit the casting floor on his right side and lay there, and the pain arrived approximately 2 seconds later, and it was very bad. But he was not dead, and he had known, from the specific moment that Fow raised the gun and the specific angle at which the gun was held, that the shot was not going to be a kill shot. Pow was not a random executioner. He was applying controlled force to extract compliance. He had shot Lucjan in the shoulder because a man with a hole in his shoulder could still open doors. He could not open these doors. There was nothing to open them with. Lucjan lay on the casting floor and breathed. The pain was structured, contained. He pushed it to one side the way he pushed non-critical furnace anomalies to one side during high-demand operations. He was aware of Fow standing over him, demanding. He was aware of the men at the doors, the growing urgency in their movements. He was aware of the temperature, because the temperature was already noticeable. The first sign, the one that people who have worked near blast furnaces know and civilians do not, is not sweat. The sweat comes later. The first sign is a change in the quality of the air, a thickening, a pressure on the sinuses, a dryness at the back of the throat that comes before any increase in skin temperature. The men near the furnaces had noticed it. Lucjan could see it in how they were moving, the slight increase in animation, the pulling at collars, the unconscious movement away from the furnace walls. One of the SS men fired at the east personnel door. A shot was very loud in the enclosed space, and the bullet did nothing meaningful to a 22mm steel blast door, except create a small depression that proved the door was exactly as solid as it appeared. Fow crouched over Lucjan. His face was close, 10, 12 centimeters. His breath smelled of cigarettes and the particular morning sourness of a man who had been awake since before dawn. He said, very quietly, in German, "Tell me how to open the doors, and I will get you a doctor." Lucjan said, in Polish, "You need the external key. I don't have it. Gro has it." "Where is Gro?" "His office. He arrives at 7. Fow stood. He went to the north wall telephone and dialed. Lucjan heard the call connect, the administrative office answering, the day shift having arrived, and heard Fow's voice, rapid and authoritative, demanding Gross. He could not hear Gross's side of the conversation. He lay on the casting floor and focused on breathing and measured the temperature by the increasing frequency of movement among Fow's men. There was, Lucjan needed to acknowledge, a critical problem. The problem was time. Gro would be called. Gross would come to the factory. Gross had a key. If Gross arrived before the temperature in the hall became unmanageable, before Pfau's men were too compromised to function, Gross would open the door and Lucjan would be shot again, this time in a location that Pfau chose for terminal effect, and 40 men would walk out into the cold February morning and board their transport vehicles and drive to wherever the B-shift workers who had not, as planned, shown up for work had been rounded up in the intervening time. The question was, how long would it take Gross to get here? Lucjan had thought about this. Gross lived in the German residential district on Ulica Slack, approximately 3.5 kilometers from the factory. He kept a car. The roads were icy. In normal conditions, 7 minutes. In icy conditions, with a man driving urgently, perhaps 10. The temperature in the hall had been rising for approximately 12 minutes since Lucjan had closed the ventilation hatches and fully opened the blast regulators. At the Foreman station, which was where the most accurate thermometer in the hall was located, the air temperature was reading 68 degrees Celsius. At this temperature, a human body at rest can function for perhaps 90 minutes. A human body in the light activity of standing, walking, beginning to panic, could function for significantly less. The upper air of the hall, near the ceiling, near the closed ventilation hatches, would be considerably hotter. Heat stratifies. The furnace workers who usually operated in this hall wore cooling vests and took mandatory rest rotations and drank water constantly. Pfau's men had none of these accommodations. 10 minutes. Call it 12. To be conservative. Gross would arrive in 10 to 12 minutes. Before he arrived, would the temperature in the hall be high enough to prevent Pfau's men from operating the door once it was opened? No. At 12 minutes, the men near the furnaces would be uncomfortable. The men near the walls would be very warm. No one would be incapacitated. Gross would open the door. The men would pour out into the -14 air of the February morning, and the situation would resolve in the Germans' favor. Lucjan had known this. He had known it when he planned, and he had planned for it, and the plan required one more action that he had not yet taken. He got to his feet. The shoulder wound had bled significantly. The canvas work jacket was soaked through on the left side, but the bleeding had slowed, and the bone, while damaged, was not so compromised that he could not use the arm in a limited way. He walked to the Furnace 1 control station. He was aware of Pau, off the telephone now, watching him with the gun still raised. He was aware of the men at the doors, some of them now openly pulling at their collars, one of them sitting down against the north wall. He walked to the Furnace 1 control station, and he put both his hands on the panel. Pfau said, "Stop. Stop where you are," Lucjan said in German, clearly and without emphasis. "At this temperature, if your men do not get water, they will begin to experience heat exhaustion in approximately 15 minutes. If they sit down and remain still, they may last longer. I recommend you have them sit against the north wall, which is the coolest part of the building. I am going to reduce the furnace temperature now." He was not going to reduce the furnace temperature. What he was going to do was activate the secondary ore feed on Furnace 1, the feed that was currently loaded and pressurized, the one that the genuine maintenance fault from 2 weeks ago had since been repaired, which meant it was now fully operational. Activating the secondary ore feed would not reduce the temperature. It would do the opposite. But the controls for the secondary ore feed were adjacent to the primary temperature controls, and the act of reaching for them looked, from 5 meters away, like the act of reaching for the temperature reduction system. Pfau was a security officer. He was not a metallurgist. Pfau lowered the gun by 10 degrees. His eyes were on the control panel. He was hot. They were all hot now, the temperature climbing steadily. His face visibly flushed, his uniform jacket already darkened with sweat at the collar and the underarms. Lucjan activated the secondary ore feed on Furnace 1. The effect was not gradual. The secondary ore feed delivered a pressurized batch of prepared iron ore directly into the furnace chamber at a rate of 3 tons per hour, accompanied by a proportional increase in the coke fuel feed, which in turn required a proportional increase in the blast air pressure to sustain combustion. The system handled this automatically. The result was an immediate and very loud increase in the furnace's voice, a roar that went up by perhaps 20 decibels in the first 3 seconds, and a visible increase in the heat radiation from the furnace casing, visible as a deepening of the orange glow at the inspection vents, and an immediate, perceptible increase in the radiant heat hitting the casting floor. The effect on the men in the hall was immediate. 3 of them near Furnace 1 dropped to the floor, not from injury, but from the instinct to get below the worst of the heat, which was stratified heavily in the upper half of the hall. 2 more ran for the north cargo doors and began hammering on them with their fists, which produced a great deal of noise and no structural effect whatsoever on 22mm steel blast doors with fully engaged bolts on both sides. Pfau turned from Lucjan to his men. It was a small movement, but it was a movement, and Lucjan used it. He crossed the 6 paces from the Furnace 1 station to the Furnace 2 station and activated the secondary ore feed on Furnace 2. Furnace 2 joined Furnace One's voice. The hall went loud. Not the sustained, bearable roar of furnaces at normal operation, but a sound that was categorically different, a sound that carried physical weight, that pressed on the chest and the ears. The temperature reading at the Foreman station jumped 4 degrees in 30 seconds. The walls were hot to the touch. The air above the casting floor shimmered with such intensity that the far end of the hall was barely visible. Foul fired. The shot went wide. The heat, the noise, the disorientation of a man whose body was telling him to get out of this building, while his training was telling him to maintain command. These things do not promote marksmanship. Lucjan moved along the east wall, staying low, moving toward the Foreman station. He made it. He climbed the 3 steps and put the platform between himself and Pfau's line of sight. He looked at the temperature reading, 91 degrees Celsius at the Foreman station. The Foreman station was 15 meters from the nearest furnace. At the furnaces themselves, the air temperature would be 130, 140 degrees. The men who had been standing near the furnaces were on the floor now, not unconscious, not yet, but down crawling, trying to get to the cooler north wall where the distance from the furnaces was greatest. The door. Lucjan looked at the east personnel door. It was locked from the inside. He had the internal bolt engaged. He was now, he acknowledged to himself, in a situation where every second he stayed in this building was a second closer to his own incapacitation. The heat that was killing Pfau's men was also affecting him. His shoulder was a secondary concern. His core body temperature was the primary one. He was sweating heavily. His vision had the characteristic flatness of the early stages of heat fatigue. He had one option. The service access hatch above Furnace 2, 4 meters up on the north face of the furnace casing, accessible from the maintenance ladder on the furnace's east side. The hatch had not been used in 6 years. It led to a service crawlway that ran along the top of the furnace casing and connected to the external wall access at a point approximately 5 meters above the external ground level, where an iron ladder descended to the outside. He had tested the hatch in October. It opened. He had not tested it under these conditions. Furnace 2 at full blast, the ladder rungs radiating heat, the crawlway hot with the thermal output of the furnace casing directly below. He had no other option. He came down from the foreman's platform. He crossed the casting floor at a run. Not the measured pace he had used for everything else in this operation, but a run, because running was appropriate now. He was aware of men on the floor, men crawling. One man who was upright near the west wall, with his hands over his ears, his face the particular red of a man in serious heat, distress. He was aware of the furnace wall radiating against the left side of his face as he passed it. He found the maintenance ladder on the east face of Furnace 2, and he climbed. The first 3 rungs were tolerable. Hot, but tolerable. The 4th rung, at approximately 1.5 meters from the floor, was the point at which the heat from the furnace casing became genuinely dangerous. The iron of the ladder was radiating at a temperature that required his leather gloves, which he had taken from the tool shelf at the Foreman station when he passed it, and even through the gloves the heat was significant, the skin of his palms registering it as a continuous structured burn. He climbed. 6 rungs. 7. The temperature of the air he was breathing was not survivable for long. He was aware of this the way he was always aware of physical data, precisely, without panic, as a constraint to be worked with him. He climbed without looking down. He found the service hatch at the top of the ladder, a round-cornered rectangle of steel plate, 60 centimeters by 40, with a swing latch on the inside. He gripped the latch. The metal burned through the gloves. He opened the hatch. The crawlway beyond it was dark and hot and smelled of iron oxide and old oil. He pulled himself through. He closed the hatch behind him. The sound of the hall diminished, not the heat, which was conducted through the furnace casing directly below his hands and knees, but the sound. He could think in here. He could calculate. He moved along the crawlway, 20 meters to the external access point. He moved as quickly as the crawlway's 40-centimeter height allowed, which was a sustained crawl, the leather apron protecting his knees, his gloved hands burning against the hot surface. He counted the meters by the junctions of the furnace casing segments beneath him, each junction detectable by a slight ridge in the floor of the crawlway. He had counted 12 segments in October when he surveyed the route. He counted them again now. He reached the external access point at the 12th segment. The external wall hatch was here, another rectangular plate, this one with an external facing swing latch. He opened it. The cold hit him like a physical blow, -14 degrees Celsius after the inside of that hall. His body processed it as pain before it processed it as cold. The contrast was severe enough to register as injury across all his exposed skin simultaneously. He sucked in one breath of cold air, and his lungs contracted sharply around it. He held onto the hatch frame with both hands. He was 5 meters above the ground, on the northeast corner of the production hall exterior, looking out at the concrete apron and the factory perimeter wall and the grey February sky above Krakow. The SS transport vehicles were parked on the apron, 2 large trucks and a smaller staff car, all empty, their engines cold. There were no guards on the perimeter. Pfau had brought everyone inside. He descended the external ladder. His left arm was not usable for gripping. The shoulder wound had stiffened, and the blood loss had weakened the arm significantly. He descended one-armed, right hand and feet, pressed against the ladder, each rung deliberate and controlled, until he reached the ground. He stood on the concrete apron in the -14 air and breathed. He did not look back at the production hall. He could hear it. The furnaces audible even through the walls, a sound that was different from any sound the hall had ever made in his experience, deeper and more relentless, and he allowed himself to know what that sound meant, and then he moved away from the building. He walked to the eastern perimeter gate. He had his foreman's key. The perimeter gate opened. He walked through it and onto the street beyond the factory, and turned south and walked in the direction of the city. He walked for 6 minutes before he stopped at a doorway on Ulika Mogilska and sat down on the step and pressed his right hand against the left shoulder to maintain pressure on the wound, and waited for the AK contact who was supposed to be watching the factory's eastern perimeter from a position in the building across the street, and who had seen him come out and who arrived at his doorway in 4 minutes, and who got him to a safe house and then to a doctor before the morning was fully light. It took Ewald Groh 23 minutes to reach the factory. This was longer than Lucjan's estimate, because the ice on Ulika Slack had been worse than anticipated, and Gross's driver had twice had to get out of the car to clear the windshield. By the time Gross arrived at the north cargo doors of the main production hall, with his key in his hand, 23 minutes had passed since Pfau had made the telephone call. At 23 minutes, the air temperature inside the sealed main production hall had reached 112 degrees Celsius at the foreman's station level. At the furnace faces, it was considerably higher. The upper air of the hall, the air near the now sealed roof ventilation hatches, had reached 141 degrees. Gross opened the north cargo door. The official report, prepared by the SS Administrative Office in Krakow, dated February 16, 1943, and classified as secret, Reich Business, recorded the outcome as follows. Of the 40-man Sicherheitskommando, under the command of Hauptsturmführer Oskar Pfau, there were no survivors. The causes of death were consistent with acute hypothermia, inhalation of superheated air and carbon compounds, and in several cases, direct thermal burns from contact with superheated surfaces. The bodies were found concentrated at the north wall of the production hall and at the sealed door positions. One individual had apparently attempted to discharge his weapon at the external wall, presumably to create an exit point. The 3mm caliber ammunition of a standard service pistol had been insufficient to damage the structure. The report went on to note that the factory foreman, one Lucjan Nadbór, was missing and must be presumed responsible for the incident. A warrant for his arrest was issued the same day. He was never found. He was not in Krakow. He was in a safe house outside Rzeszów, wounded, feverish, being tended by a doctor who had treated AK members before, and who was not surprised by the nature of the wound or the circumstances its bearer was reluctant to describe. He stayed there for 3 weeks, while the wound healed and the fever broke, and the investigation in Krakow ran its course without him. Wisława and Artur remained with her sister in Nowa Huta until word came, through Drong's network, that Lucjan was alive and mobile. They left Krakow in March, through channels that the AK had established for exactly this kind of relocation. They crossed into Slovakia in early April and reached Switzerland in June via a route that is itself a story worth telling, though it is not this one. The 87 workers of B shift were not arrested. The intelligence warning had reached all of them through Drong's network in the days before the 11th. Every man had a reason not to come in. Some had genuinely left the city temporarily. Sick relatives, urgent errands, the ordinary porousness of civilian life under occupation that the Germans were never fully able to seal. Some had simply stayed home. None were taken to Płaszów. It is not possible to say with certainty how many of them are alive today. This account was assembled in 1994, 51 years after the event. But of the 17 who were located and interviewed for the research that produced this record, all 17 were alive. They all remembered the foreman. Several of them had not known his name. They called him Sef, the boss, the one who locked the doors. Szymon Drong survived the war. He was arrested by the Soviets in '46 on charges of AK membership and spent 3 years in Mokotów prison in Warsaw. He was released in 1949 and lived in Krakow until his death in 1973. He gave one interview to a Polish historian in 1968. In it, he described Lucjan Nadbór as the most patient man he had ever met. He said this not as praise, exactly, but as a statement of fact, the same tone a metallurgist might use to describe a particular grade of steel. Patient, reliable under pressure, given to thinking before acting, and to acting decisively when thinking was complete. Told Karch, the furnace operator who cleared the production hall on Lucjan's instruction on the morning of the 11th, retired from the ironworks in 1957 and died in 1964. He gave no interviews. His daughter, interviewed in 1992, said that her father had never discussed the events of February 1943, except once, when she asked him directly what had happened at the factory that day. He said, "The foreman knew what he was doing. That was all." The production hall of the Huta Nadbrzeże works was operational again within 3 months of the incident. Gross supervised the cleanup and a structural assessment and, finding the building sound, blast furnaces are designed to withstand extreme internal temperatures. That is their purpose. Put it back into production. Furnace 1 and Furnace 2 continued to produce pig iron for the remainder of the occupation. The ore feeds were repaired. The blast doors were replaced with a different model that used only internal bolts, eliminating the vulnerability that Lucjan had exploited. The roof ventilation hatches were fitted with locks. The locks that replaced the ones Lucjan had used were perfectly sensible countermeasures. They would have been effective against a repetition of the specific method he had employed. They did nothing about the nature of the problem they were designed to prevent, which was not a method at all. It was a man who knew his building, who had watched his building, who had understood the geometry of the situation long before the situation arrived. No lock changes that. The Walther P-38 bullet was removed from Lucjan's shoulder by the doctor outside Rzeszów and was, according to a note in the AK file, itself a document not declassified, until 1991, retained by the patient. Why he kept it is not recorded. Perhaps it was simply the thing you kept from a situation like that, not as a trophy, but as evidence of the line you had crossed and could not uncross. He had killed 40 men. The bullet in his shoulder was the only physical evidence that they had not made him pay for it. What happened to Lucjan Nadbór after Switzerland is the kind of thing that wars do to people, which is to scatter them far enough from their origins that the thread of the story becomes difficult to follow. He and Wisława and Artur settled eventually in the city of Lyon, in France, in the summer of 1944. He found work through Polish community contacts at a steel plant outside the city. He was a foundry foreman again. He worked there for 17 years. He never spoke about what he had done in Krakow, not in Poland, not in France, not to his son, who grew up in Lyon speaking French with a Polish accent and who became an engineer. A good one, working on the bridge infrastructure of the Loire Valley, which might have pleased his grandfather. Not to anyone, so far as the historical record reveals. The record is thin. It consists of one AK debrief document from 1943, classified 1991, one SS requisition document from February 1943, recovered from a Berlin archive in 1957, The Drong interview from 1968, 17 worker testimonies collected in 1993 and 1994, and one document that did not surface until 1998, when Huta Nadbór, by then a retired engineer living outside Grenoble, aged 66, found among his mother's effects a letter that his father had written in May 1943 from the safe house outside Jezo, addressed to Wisława, not yet delivered because the postal routes were impossible, kept by her for 50 years, and found by her son after her death. The letter was 5 pages. Most of it was personal, the kind of letter a husband writes to a wife when he does not know if he will see her again, about ordinary things. The flat on Rakowicka, the Sunday mornings, the sound of Artur's footsteps on the floorboards overhead, not about what he had done, not about the hall, not about the temperature or the doors or the 40 men, except at the end. 3 sentences at the end of the letter which Huta Nadbór agreed to share with the researcher who first compiled this account, and which read as follows: "I am not at peace with it. I do not know if I will be. I know that Płaszów was real, and the men who ordered it were real, and I would do the same thing again, and I think that is the most honest thing I can say about who I am now." That is as close as Lucjan Nadbór ever got to explaining himself. The furnaces are still standing. The Huta Nadbrzeże works was nationalized under the communist government, then privatized, then restructured, then partially demolished in the 1990s as Polish heavy industry was rationalized following the end of the Soviet period. The original production hall, the one with the blast doors and the roof ventilation hatches and the 14-meter furnaces, was designated a protected historical structure in 2004. It stands in the industrial north of Krakow, unused, the furnaces cold for the first time in their existence. The blast doors are original, or close to it, replacements from 1943, but original to the building as it was used for most of its operational life. If you stand in front of them, they do not look like the doors of a killing ground. They look like what they are: heavy, industrial, functional, a steel plate on steel hinges, the architecture of production, not of war. But the building knows, all buildings do, eventually, the way that all metal knows its history, in the grain structure, in the fatigue marks, in the invisible record of every temperature it has ever been subjected to. A metallurgist can read a piece of steel the way a reader reads a page. Every stress, every extreme, every moment when the material was asked to perform beyond its normal parameters. It's all there, in the microscopic structure of the grain, if you know how to look. Lucjan Nadbór knew how to look. He knew how to read what the material was telling him, and what the material of his situation in February of 1943 told him was this: there is a set of constraints, and inside those constraints there is exactly one solution, and the solution requires you to act now and reckon with it later. He acted, he reckoned with it for the rest of his life, in the quiet, private way that his father had taught him to do things, completely, honestly, without performing the reckoning for anyone else's benefit. He died in Lyon in 1981. He was 77 years old. He had been a foundry foreman for over 40 years of his life. The furnaces at the Lyon plant ran hot on the day of his funeral, which is to say they ran as they always did, as they had run throughout his tenure, exactly as he had taught the men under him to run them. Precisely, patiently, with full attention to what the system required. The heat does not lie. That was what Witold Karch had told him once, in 1929, when Lucjan was a young assistant foreman and still learning the vocabulary of the furnace. You can adjust it, you can manage it, you can direct it, but it will always do exactly what it is going to do, given the conditions it is given. Your job is to understand the conditions so well that you know before the furnace does what is coming. He understood the conditions, all of them, and on a cold February morning in a sealed hall in Krakow, he gave the heat what it needed to do the rest.